Are we starting? Oh, welcome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Mary Strain, and I lead our artificial intelligence and machine learning strategy for U.S. education. We're delighted to have you here today for this very exciting panel on an incredibly transversal use case that's had a lot of impact at UCLA. So we are here for Boost Fundraising with Hyper-Personalization, powered by Amazon Bedrock. In this session, we'll discover how the University of California, Los Angeles, Anderson School of Management used AWS and Anthropic's Claude Sonnet LLM to revolutionize their alumni engagement strategy in partnership with Slalom. Donation conversion increased by 86% and donation size by 26%, improving dollars raised by a staggering 132%. We're going to learn about the architecture that seamlessly integrated customized content with donor data to strategically deliver emails at optimal times, significantly boosting open rates and maximizing outreach effectiveness. So I'm sure all of you who are working on campuses can appreciate how valuable this session will be in sort of supporting your fundraising capabilities, but I think this also speaks to hyper-personalization across all areas of the campus life. I'm joined today by some outstanding panelists. First, we have Howard Miller. Howard is currently the Chief Information Officer at UCLA Anderson School of Management. Prior to joining UCLA, Howard was the Acting Chief Information Officer and CISO at Columbia Business School. Howard is an accomplished executive and senior IT leader with expertise in the design, development, and deployment of technical strategy and policy. Howard holds an MBA degree from Management Information Systems and a bachelor's degree in computer science from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Howard also has several professional certifications, including PMP, CISM, and CRISC. Thank you, Howard, for joining us. We're also joined today by James Meadow. James leads global AI and machine learning delivery at Slalom Consulting, where he develops strategic AI solutions that drive transformative impact across industries. With a PhD in genomics and statistics, James is passionate about leveraging data science and machine learning to advance education, amplify social impact, and promote environmental sustainability. Our last presenter today is my colleague, Patrick Frontiera. Patrick leads the campus and IT operations portfolio at Amazon Web Services. In this role, Patrick is responsible for ensuring that colleges and universities successfully use AWS to sustain and differentiate their institutions. Prior to his role at AWS, Patrick was the CIO at Loyola Marymount University, where he was responsible for ensuring that the academic technology, administrative computing, infrastructure technology, and user support teams provided services that enabled LMU's mission. Before joining higher education, Patrick was the director of software development at a startup company in Santa Barbara and an application developer at PeopleSoft. I want to welcome Patrick to the stage and begin this wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Mary. I want to remind everyone that this is an L200 presentation, so the bulk of the discussion today will be technical in nature, and James will be walking through the technical architecture and implementation approach that UCLA and Slalom took to enable their fundraising. So I first want to spend a little bit of time talking about AWS in higher education, where we're seeing universities begin to adopt generative AI capabilities in support of their missions. And I want to close my part of the presentation on a conversation about advancement, the important event of advancement offices to institutions of higher education. I will then hand off to Howard, who will talk about UCLA's challenges and what led to this project, and then James will finish with the technical architecture and implementation approach. So the mission of AWS in higher education is to create an environment where higher education can thrive by building resilience and powering innovation. Resilience in this context in higher education is not just about building resilient applications, although it is that. It's also about doing things big, like reimagining business models that help higher education institutions sustain a very uncertain present and an uncertain future. So we are working with higher education in things big and small to improve their resilience. That's an ambitious mission. How do we accomplish this? We accomplish this by focusing on 4 areas. As Mary mentioned, I'm responsible for the IT and campus operations portfolio, so I'm responsible for ensuring that universities build a strong digital foundation, both for data and technology, not just within IT, but across the institution, to enable the other 3 focus areas. The first of those is student experience. So when we talk with universities, it's obviously tantamount that their students learn better in their classes, but also navigate a really, really cumbersome administrivia that our institutions have unfortunately made available to students. The second area is around research and scholarship. So we enable institutions by using AWS to power their research portfolios, but also the research administration that wraps around those portfolios and that initiates these research agendas. And then finally, community engagement is the 4th area where we work with higher education institutions to really empower them. And this is both in the athletics departments at universities, but it's also in advancement offices, and that is going to be the focus of the discussion today. Where we're seeing Bedrock-enabled strategies be implemented into production over the past year generally align with 2 areas. One is student success. So again, how can we use generative AI to improve students' experiences both in the classroom and in navigating the universities? It's obviously critical for universities to improve outcomes like student retention and 4- and 6-year graduation rates where that is applicable. And so we use generative AI to help universities solve against those problems. The other area where we're seeing a lot of interest is organizational success. And there's overlap between these 2 themes, no doubt. But for organizational success, how can we help universities become more efficient, more effective? And again, that's where we're going to spend time today, because the advancement project that UCLA implemented is all about improving their organizational effectiveness. So let's dive into why advancement matters. Again, that's part of the community engagement focus area. This is a chart from the 2022 National Center for Education Statistics data that shows revenue sources by institution control type. The yellow bar in this chart is the revenue that institutions use based on returns from their investments. The investments are created as a result of the work that advancement offices do. Also, in the maroon part of this graph are gifts that are categorized as investments that are not contributed to the endowment but help to offset operational cost. So the yellow bar is where we're focused and the maroon bar is where we're focused, and it's vital that institutions have vibrant fundraising mechanisms. And so that's where university advancement offices come into play. So University Advancement Office fundamental mission is to increase philanthropy to close short-term operational costs and improve long-term institutional stability. And they do this by reaching out to alumni who are obviously have a vested interest in their institutional success, to prospects who may be aligned with the mission and care passionately about the mission of the institution, and also corporations and foundations. So that's the context of advancement offices and why it's so important that advancement offices pay attention to fundraising capabilities, and a little bit about how AWS supports higher education. If anyone's interested in learning more, please visit us at the education booth in the Industries Pavilion. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Howard, who's going to talk about UCLA's challenges.
Hopefully I'm on here. Yep, that's good. And we are on the right slide, even better, and these lights are really bright, so that's just the way it works. So I am Howard Miller from UCLA Anderson. As mentioned before, I'm happy to tell you the story of why we're here. It's kind of interesting for me as I was prepping earlier today and looking at some of the emails that I got that I'm talking about fundraising on what's Giving Tuesday. So I don't know if that's irony, I don't know if that's coincidence, I don't know if it's fate, but it at least makes for a good story in all of this. So again, the story, Why did we do this? What was of interest to us, right? So on the spirit of Giving Tuesday, it's all about bringing in more money to the institution, as Patrick showed in the previous slide. Raising more money is always important. The other component of raising money is around having engaged alumni. UCLA Anderson has a population of somewhere around 45,000 alumni. It's hard to get their attention. Again, if I go back to the fact that today is Giving Tuesday, how many of those emails might you have gotten that you just looked at that subject and said, nah, not interested, or nah, don't really care, right? So this combination of how do we bring in more money, how do we get alumni's attention, how do we get them more involved in the fold is all one of the reasons why we did this exercise. I think equally important to me is that middle bullet there around embracing innovation, right? So the folks at Slalom came to me and they said, well, we like to do innovative things. We've heard you like to do innovative things. What could we innovate on together? And oh, by the way, there's this thing called generative AI. Wouldn't it be neat if we could find a use case that would make sense for us to pursue with generative AI? And so with that, away we went. So I think what I'm most proud about with this story is really the whole approach to the story. And you'll see on the slide here, it doesn't even really say, no, I'm not going to play with the buttons. It doesn't say UCLA Anderson's approach. It just says UCLA's approach, right? And this story really resonates with me because this was the entire Build a community, right? If I start externally first, I had support from AWS. Slalom is the consulting partner. Again, we don't accomplish any of that without either AWS or Slalom. Internally, I'm not sure how much you know about UCLA, how much you care about UCLA, but Anderson is one of the larger IT distributed units on campus. If you're a UCLA alum, if you're a UCLA Anderson alum, you're also a UCLA alum. So Anderson doesn't technically own that relationship. It all lives with main campus, with IT external affairs. So there was Anderson involvement, and not only IT involvement, but business stakeholder involvement, and then IT external affairs involvement. So when you put all of that together, in order for this to happen in the time frame in which it happened, it really needed all of those parts to come together to really come up with an outstanding solution. Okay? If you ever listen to me talk, or you want to listen to me talk, or even if you don't care to listen to me talk, I talk a lot about the art of the possible. It goes back to this embrace innovation. And I also go back to all those emails that you got earlier today. And one of the things that was very exciting about what we were doing here is how do we get to a better subject? It gets back to how do you get to that alumni engagement. So if you just look at all of those, and I won't read them all to you, but you could have a lot of fun with the subject of an email from formal, which you may not want to engage in because it's too stuffy, all the way to neutral. Okay, maybe that's interesting. Well, maybe my gift could transform Anderson, down to the clickbait. I don't know if you're going to click on it if it says make laugh all the way to the bank, but it at least gets your attention, right? And that's the point. Again, on the art of the possible with the generative AI, and again, the generative AI leads itself to the email subject. It also leads in well with donation suggestions, and we'll see a little bit of this on the next slide when we get into some of the data that was used to train this model. But again, in addition to generating the whole body of the email, which is just blacked out there, it's sort of irrelevant for the purposes of this discussion, but the Gen AI is very powerful in being able to come up with those suggested donation amounts based upon how the model was trained and what it knows about you. And again, back to Patrick's point about the personalization. So with that said, and James will talk about the timeline and all of the details behind what we did here. It's a relatively short timeline. I'm not going to go into all of these points. But if I go into some of the key attributes around which this model was trained, obviously name, email, giving history. Again, it gets back to that point about how you can personalize the email if you know how much someone has given. What program they belong to, what year they graduated, right? And so again, compressed timeline, maybe not as much data as we would have wanted. And if you look at the column on the right around potential data, right? We could have given it something about where you live, because maybe if you live in a certain demographic, you'd be more willing to give or more able to give. Again, specifically around maybe what you gave to in the past. If there's a specific fund, did you give to the Dean's Fund? Did you give to Underrepresented Students Fund? Whatever that is. Again, the more you can give it, the more data you have, the better data you have, the better the model is going to be. So where does this all lead us at this point, right? For me, the benefits for all of UCLA, because again, what we have is a production application. It works. It wasn't done with the full population of 50,000 alumni, but it was done with enough of a sample to give us those great statistics that we gave you at the beginning. And again, we're very happy and we know it works, and that's the spoiler alert, and Mary gave away a lot of the trade secrets, and James is going to bring that home at the end. But again, we came up with a very compelling business case. For me, again, it opens the door about how we can use generative AI, and also that holy grail of what else is beyond generative AI. We know that generative AI works, but what's out there in machine learning? What's out there in AI? What else can we do with personalization? And then again, the last one is probably the most important of all of those points right now. You can't have good AI without data. You've probably heard that 100 times. You'll probably hear it another 100 times, and maybe another 100 times after that, right? But it really helps us set the stage institutionally for better data hygiene and better governance. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to James. There you go, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'll talk through each phase of the project. This was an 8-week project. Like a lot of AI projects that we're trying these days, we don't want to spend too much time. We want to get results. We want to understand if this is worth the big investment. We did this in 8 weeks. It felt fast, and we got a lot done in that time. Today, I'm going to spend most of the time talking about weeks 3 and weeks 4 through 5, really constraining LLM behavior. It doesn't do what you want to do right out of the box, and we spent quite a bit of time on that, and especially on human validation that happens after that. One important piece about this project, it was a bit of a POC. It was a test. We wanted to find out, is this going to work well enough to invest in the future and to bring this to other clients as well? But we also sent real emails to real people. And so we had to be absolutely sure that the results were clear. We were 100% confident with everything that we were sending out, so as not to risk any sort of reputational risk along the way. And so that's the human validation part that is partly to make us really confident in the solution. Just to back up and understand the problem that we're dealing with here, this is an email that I will send directly to spam, and I do every time. And it's not a good habit, but most of us do. If you look at the numbers for fundraising, it's a really low success rate game. You send out a lot, and you hope for enough to keep the organization moving. So you can see here, it's not very personal. We might insert some variables. In fact, sometimes you get these emails where the variables weren't even inserted. There's a lot to improve here. And so we wanted to find out, top to bottom, what could we use AI for to improve this process, to improve donations at the end of the day? First question is, can AI do this right now? This is something that we're all asking every time you come up with an interesting business question. Well, I'll go ask AI itself and see if we can solve this. So I sent a little bit of my information to Claude. Here's some of the data that we might expect to get in a project like this. Can you write a compelling fundraising email? And it turns out, right out of the gate, yes, no problem. This seems like a good fundraising email, but it's wordy. It's really long. That's a normal problem with AI, and we'll get into that. It is personalized in a really impressive way, actually, if you read through it. It got a lot of things right, but it also looks like it's written by AI. And you can sniff this out in any message that you get back from an AI tool these days. So there's a lot that we would need to do to improve this result. But as a first test, yes, absolutely, AI is up to this task right now. And then we can go through a few of the extra requirements about it. Number one, we need a thoughtful subject. That gets the reader to open the email. That's the first metric that we want to count. Number two, we want to personalize it so that it's not mundane. You want it to speak to you so that you can actually read through it and get to the part where you might click through to a donation. We want an appropriate human-like tone. This is one of the things that we've all noticed. LLMs are not great at this sometimes. You can still pick out that LLM tone, and so we wanted to massage that a little bit. We wanted personalized donation options, like here laid out, and so we wanted to make sure that we're not asking someone for a really big donation if they have a history of small donations, or vice versa. We want to test out a little humor. This is something that is really engaging in emails like this, but it's not clear really if LLMs are up to that task. So that's a little bit of a stretch goal. And then most importantly, we need to measure everything that we do in this project. We only have 8 weeks. We have a limited budget. We don't want to break the bank on this first test. And so let's get all the data that we can so that we can make a good decision coming out of it. So first of all, we spend a little bit of time looking at models. When this project was happening, Claude 3 had been released. We looked at several models that we could access through Bedrock and found that pretty consistently Claude 3 gave us a really good human-like tone. It gave us a consistently good answer each time. All of those things need to be adjusted. None of this was perfect right out of the gate, but it was clear that we could move forward with Claude 3. And then we spend a little bit more time looking at a few of the top parameters. So do we want it to be really creative? Probably not in something like this. We want it to be dutiful about the data that we sent in and not take too many liberties. So you can adjust something like temperature. And so we played with parameters until we were getting the tone that we wanted, and then we dive in with deeper prompt engineering. In terms of the solution, this was a POC. It was relatively small footprint within AWS, and we wanted to move quickly. So first of all, in any project like this, you'd probably want to hook into your customer data or your alumni data in somewhere like Salesforce. We wanted to move quickly, and so we got an extract of the right amount of alumni, and then we dropped that into S3 to be used for the models. We can ingest that and treat the data along the way. We queue it up so that we can run through 3,000 emails or a few thousand emails, and then send them to the LLM, combine those, merge them down below, and then send that output back into Salesforce so that we can use the Marketing Cloud functionality to inject some of the last few parameters, send it out to the right people. On the far right side, we did this as a randomized sample. So what you'll see at the very end, every 5 years, this was a 5-year anniversary run. And so you see alumni every 5 years. And so we stratified that across each of those groups. We sent 1,500 AI-generated emails and 1,500 of the standard process emails so that we could measure that really well. I want to go back to the middle to the generate blocks. Those are Lambda functions, just Python code that's written to take in data, and we're going to get into this in just a moment, take in some of the data, inject that into the prompts, send it to an LLM, in this case Claude 3, get back the results, do some validation, and then merge those results. We found that it works really well to break that into smaller tasks. So for instance, if we're targeting 2 different paragraphs in the email, you don't necessarily want it to do everything in one run. Sometimes results degrade over time. But if you break that into a really narrow scope, one paragraph does this thing, and then you pass that in, and then another call for another paragraph that does another specific thing. We found that that was really nice in a couple of different steps. In any project like this, defining the scope that you give to an LLM is very important. So just to step back in terms of all the things that we can do with LLMs these days, this is not really a RAG because we're not hitting a knowledge base in the background. We're passing in data, and then we're getting back a predictive response. This is not really agentic because we're not giving it too many autonomous tasks to make. Really, this is using an LLM in the same way that we've been using predictive models for a long time. You take in data, and you get a predictive response out the back end. And so we need to define that scope really well. You can see at the top, there's an option where we just let it write the whole thing, like what I did in the example in the very beginning. The subject line, all of the text, all the personalization, all the options. At the bottom, at the generic response, that would be no personalization, but we want AI to teach us how to write a better fundraising email. And we did a little bit of that, but that's not really what we chose. The full body option is where we focus, or the body only option is where we focused. So that means we picked the most impactful paragraph where we think that personalized data can make a big impact, and then we really focus our efforts right there. Now around the edges, we used Claude to, for instance, suggest a lot of different subject lines that are going to work for us, and we as humans can go through and pick those. Suggest a timeline to send this out to all these folks at the beginning of the business day, at the end of the business day. There's AI tools that do that really well. So we tried to find everywhere we could inject AI into this fundraising process. And if we step back a little bit for the autonomy, or the anatomy of a fundraising email, you've got the top matter. Like I said, we're not really giving that to Claude in an automated way. We're going to select the subject lines that we like. You've got that first paragraph that might be pretty standard. We don't really need to change a lot of that language. We can inject a couple of variables like the graduation year, but there's not much for Claude to do, so we don't want to waste tokens on that. But that big blue paragraph, that's the really high impact one. We can talk about the work that they did in their program. We can talk about the years that they were there, the sports teams. We can talk about some of the data that we're able to pass into the LLM. So we really focused right there. And then we use AI to, for instance, come up with buckets for fundraising. And down at the bottom, we used AI to optimize a 7-day period for when to send out those emails. I thought that was a really clever thing to do with AI. And then here's where we spend quite a bit of time, constraining LLM responses. In case you haven't noticed, LLMs are very wordy. You have to tell it over and over again, shorten that output. Make this only 100 words. Make this 100 words for real this time. You kind of have to repeat that sometimes. AI is really pushy as well. So it can inject a lot of exclamation points, which might be an awkward thing to have in a fundraising email. It's not something we're excited about. We're making a compelling case for donation. And so we really had to adjust that tone to make sure that it matched exactly the task that we were working on. And then finally, we can use Salesforce in the end of the process to inject a few of those variables that we didn't give to AI. Anytime you're dealing with LLMs, especially in an automated way, I think it's really important to have a framework. In this case, the engagement lead on the project found a great framework at the time that did everything we needed it to do. And so we followed this each time we built out prompts. This is just one example that came from Kyle Ballmer. And there's a lot of frameworks that do the same thing. But in general, you announce the role. This is what you're about to do. You give it high-level instructions. You're going to write a fundraising email. It's going to have these sorts of things. And then you break down steps one by one. Take these steps. Make sure that you hit these requirements. The end goal describes what we want out of the end. I think this is really important and something that we might leave off sometimes. And then finally, narrowing the scope. Like I said, reducing the word count, making sure that you don't throw in salutations, and sometimes you have to ask for that more than once. And so if you can follow a framework, you can get a really consistent response over time. And again, we really wanted this to happen in an automated way for thousands of emails with as low validation effort as we could. And so getting this right in the beginning is very important. Here's a really interesting thing that if you haven't tried this yet, I think it works really well. And we do this quite a lot. Conditional prompting the same way you would data engineering or any other kind of software engineering. You pass in a little bit of data, some bit of personalization. You inject that into the prompt. And the prompt itself, after you repeat that thousands of times, each one has its own piece of data that reacts a slightly different way. So for instance, you can see here, if this person received a fellowship, let's include that in the message. Let's remind them that fellowship came from donations like this, and you can pay it forward. Say something about it. If they didn't get the fellowship, don't mention it and move on. And we were able to use a few different data flags in this process to make sure that we were personalizing and using the data in the right way. And there's a couple of different ways to think about validation. One is automated. You don't want to read all of these 1,500 or 3,000 emails to make sure that there's not something wrong. LLMs are a wonderful validation tool. So you can get the response, and before you merge it out as a final result, you can send that back with the instructions, with the data, to an independent LLM call and just say, did this work as expected? Did we follow instructions? Is this a good email? So you can structure that prompt in the same way to make sure that you just get a yes or a no. In this case, we got a pass or a fail flag. So a small percentage fail. LLMs hallucinate a lot. They give you some weird response some percentage of the time. And we wanted to make sure to catch all those. And then we get to human validation. So we spent a good amount of time validating every single fail and trying to understand what went wrong here and can we adjust the prompt in the beginning to reduce that number. And then we also human validated some subset of the passing grades to make sure that we were very comfortable with everything that was coming out. If it's a pass, we just want to convince ourselves that it really is a pass and we can trust this to go out to a person. And speaking of frameworks, here's one that I think works really well for human validation. Humans are even worse than LLMs at being consistent in our validation. And so it's really important to have a consistent way to grade each of these things, especially across multiple people. This was published after we did the project, but I like it because it included a lot of the things that we did in human validation that I thought went really well. So I just want to highlight it here. Number one, is the quality high? Is this a high quality response? Did the LLM follow directions, right? Did the LLM understand, and is the response understandable? Is the style right? Are there too many exclamation points? Is it being too pushy, being too wordy? Is there anything in here that we should think about for safety and harm? So for instance, when we're trying out humor, that might be a really big issue. Some of these jokes might not want to go out to a wide audience. We didn't necessarily have that problem here, but it's a really important thing to validate as humans to make sure that this meets our standards. And then finally, do we trust this solution enough to send this email out? Now, surprisingly, it worked really well, the first test. And so as you go down through these results, one of the things that I want to point out, we start with 3,000 emails at the top, 1,500 for AI, 1,500 in the standard process. And those numbers drop precipitously. And so, for instance, email open rate, that's a pretty high number. And we can be quite sure that that 19% is a great response. Once you get all the way down to that 132% money raised, we're happy about that. But those are pretty small numbers. And given that this is a really small test that we did just to make sure, we were really confident that the results that we got were worth the investment to go forward and do this in a bigger way. Now, speaking of small numbers, I think as we start to inject AI into our daily lives, into the things that we do at work, it is kind of interesting to see how people respond to AI. For instance, we might be able to find out with a bigger study that this result is true, that my generation is incredibly generous with our donations, and that we respond really well to AI. Or that the most recent graduating class from 2019 only responds to generative AI. Now, we don't have the numbers to support that, but I think it's really interesting to track how humans respond as we start to inject these tools. And thinking about the lessons learned. So, number one, we were able to bring together Bedrock and a lot of different AWS services with the existing Salesforce Marketing Cloud process. So we didn't have to rip out the process that they used. We were able to inject AI pretty seamlessly into that as a first test. We were able to do it purely in their secure AWS environment. This is very important and secure alumni data, and so we had to be really careful with that. This was a limited size. You can't send it out to everybody on the first try. We selected a number that would give us enough confidence that we wanted to move on, but not that we would break the bank on this first test. So 3,000 is a relatively small number, and yet we got pretty promising results from this first run. And any time that you're building out a new process like this, you use up a lot more time, most likely, to train, to ask for a little extra help, to inject this process. So for instance, we might ask a lot of time in human validation. You don't necessarily need that human validation step if you're following the traditional fundraising email process. Or we might maybe not want to dig into the secure Salesforce environment, and so instead, we worked with our clients to make sure that they were hands-on keyboard in Salesforce, and that took a lot of their time. But once we can integrate these systems, that lift goes down over time. What's next? This was promising enough that we definitely want to keep going. We want to explore what else can we do with this. We focused on a pretty narrow slice of the fundraising process. And in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that we could go further with this. And we want to understand more opportunities to use AI, machine learning, a lot of different methods to try to accelerate the fundraising process, to make it more efficient over time. And also that bottom line, to continue to increase donations coming into the school so that the school can thrive over time.
Thank you all very much for joining the session. Really appreciated the engagement.